Hello, my name is Zach Paget, and this is me giving my final for my archaeology class that is online. I did my topic on this, the bioarchaeology of ancient Egypt. First, I'd like to start off with a quote that is from one of the first pages here. A student not only studies Egyptology, but is also inducted into a community of fellow students, faculty, and scholars. The budding scholar not only grows in knowledge, but is socialized into a scholarly culture with its own attitudes and perspectives. My journal has many different topics on it, but one of the first ones is uh, the topic was how did the Egyptians heat the public and private bathhouses? And they would normally do that with wood with most ancient cultures, but since Egypt was in the middle of a desert, there's not that many trees around. So they assume that because wood was so scarce, that they would use straw and reed, according to ancient Egyptologists. One of the ways that archaeologists normally can put a time date on an artifact is if it's made out of wood, they can normally count the rings on the tree or basically on the plank of wood that was once in the tree. But in the journal here, they decide not to do that because of the fact that most of the wood are like boats. And I would do something about like carbon dating the trees or something like that. The next topic in my journal was they found a sarcophagus that had bacteria in it, and the bacteria were still alive after several thousand years. The bacteria were Bacillus and Penicillium, and from what it looks like here, it looks like they just kind of popped open the sarcophagus and just kind of poked around in there, and I really wouldn't have done that. Maybe I would have opened it a little bit, but I mean, I just wanted to just like open the whole thing up, and or maybe I would have just like drilled a small hole in the side to like keep it still sealed, and just taken like samples of air from the inside of the sarcophagus. And then also inside the sarcophagus, they found a linen manuscript that the bacteria was basically feeding off of the last several thousand years, and they were able to tell how active the bacteria were by that manuscript's decay. Another thing that they did with the bacteria they found in the sarcophagus is they took it to a lab and they basically fiddled around with it with other bacteria of the same family to see if the bacteria that had supposedly survived for so many thousands of years was actually there from the beginning of those thousands of years, or if it had just snuck in somewhere in the side. They use several types of microscopes and other such materials to analyze the bacteria, and I gotta agree. I think that's a good idea to do that. The next topic is that they found seeds that they believe belong to lettuce plants in Egypt a couple of years ago, and they're trying to figure out if Egypt actually was able to grow lettuce back in the day. After several experiments, were able to find out that lettuce was actually, in fact, used as part of a ritual to a fertility god because the latex that species of lettuce grew on it looked similar to semen, so they would offer it up to the god of fertility. My reasoning behind why they would do that is because, I mean, anything back then that could mean fertility, you wanted a family with a lot of kids back then so you could be prosperous and wealthy and all that other stuff. However, they were able to identify that there were at least two species of lettuce that were able to grow in Egypt since the fourth dynasty, and my question to that is, how were they able to tell which one was? I mean, they both grew latex. Which one was the better one? It doesn't really say, and they were able to regrow it, but I mean, I guess they deemed it not important enough to put into the paper. The next topic that the journal goes on to is the Paleo Basin, known as the Dekla Basin, which is basically an oasis that has been inhabited by living creatures in the middle of the desert for millions and millions of years. And it's been not only inhabited since the mid-Pleistocene era, but it's been continually throughout Ice Age and like heat waves and all the other stuff until at least 3500 BC. Over the last several years, they found hundreds and hundreds of artifacts from that paleo oasis, and they can carbon date some of them, but a lot of them they can't because what they normally would use is they use pollen dating, and since Egypt is very dry, pollen does not last very long. But I mean, they could use something like charcoal, like with burnt stuff by early humans, and they can look for any like macro remains. They found three different types of cultural remains at the Paleo Oasis. It was by the Mashura, the Bashendi, and the Sheikh Mufsta. And I'm sure I butchered those names terribly, and I apologize, but they were able to basically divide them up into multiple sections because of how they found the stuff. For instance, with the Bashendi, they've mostly found wild cereals like grains and rice and things like that. And however, from the Sheik uh, time period, they found almost no plants whatsoever, but they did find a lot of animal remains with human teeth marks on it, suggesting that the Sheik, the desert was very hot during the Sheik times, and if the desert's hot and you can't grow plants, you gotta eat something, and they ended up eating animals. So I agree with that. I mean, if the and it's about around 4400 BC that they really think that it starts to heat up in Egypt, where because before 4400 BC, it would go really wet, then really dry, then really wet, then really dry. But I mean, once 4400 BC hit, it's been pretty arid since then, and that's about the time where they find most of the Sheik artifacts. During the age of the Sheik period, the population density dropped a lot, and I mean, it started in the Old Kingdom, and it just didn't stop since then. And by the time Alexander the Great came around, there was barely anybody able to fight off Alexander the Great's army. So I think the lack of plants would be a contributing factor to the lack in population. The next topic the journal goes to is ancient Egyptian varnishes, which are complex media varnishes that were supposedly discovered about 1,000 years before anyone expected Egypt to. And it appears that they normally get these varnishes from trees or such, but the article makes a reference to a Palestinian mountain, also known as Mount Atlas Pistachio. And I think that they could get a lot of resin from there as well, but they'd have to trade with the Palestinians, which would be a good thing, because then you're trading with your neighbors. But a lot of them, I mean, it's from ancient Egypt to the times where Romans ran Egypt, and a lot of the varnishes seem to be mostly for like imperial purposes. However, I don't think that it would only be for imperial purposes alone, because, I mean, if you were wealthy, that didn't automatically make you imperial, but if you were wealthy, you could afford the varnishes. So maybe wealthy traders or merchants would have varnishes as well. But, I mean, I just don't think that the varnishes would be solely for imperial use. When an ancient Egyptian died, if they were wealthy enough, they normally were mummified. And in the mummification process, they used lots of different like herbs such as henna, rosemary, myrtle, and then red and yellow myrrh. And all these products are found in contemporary insecticides, herbicides, even antibacterial like ointments. And first, I think it's amazing that the ancient Egyptians were able to figure this out. Like, oh, if we rub this plant on the dead body, insects won't eat it. And just absolutely amazing. One of the great things about ancient Egypt is how they preserved bodies, and most of the world copies that to this day. One of the better examples being Vladimir Lenin from Russia, and when he died in 1924, they preserved his body almost immediately, and it stayed on public display with a few exceptions when like it looked like Nazis were gonna attack Russia. And but I mean, once it was out of danger, they would bring it back out. But it was on display from 1924 until 2011 when they decided that Lenin's body should actually be buried. And that's just amazing to me that, I mean, they used the same techniques that the ancient Egyptians used, and while having different chemicals, of course, but I mean, still, they had insecticides to keep the bugs off him and antibacterial stuff to keep him from getting eaten by bacteria, and just simply astounding. The techniques used to preserve the dead bodies in ancient Egypt were also used in early Christianity when they would just have tombs and they would just leave the dead bodies right on a tomb. So the family could come by and see it, and they didn't really want to see a rotting corpse of their once loved ones. So a lot of people say that the Christians came up with it first. However, according to a lot of research, the ancient Egyptians did come up with it first. And Christianity has been known to copy other religions to help, like when someone would conquer, like a Christianity army would conquer another country, they change their religion to match Christianity's. A great example being when Christians were invading Norway. The end of the Norse religion is what's known as Ragnarok, which is like Armageddon, but there was three surviving things: one man, one woman, and the world tree called Yggdrasil. And in the beginning of the Christian religion, it's actually Adam being one man, Eve being one woman, and the Garden of Eden like being Yggdrasil, the world tree. So there are a lot of similarities in religions if you look carefully, and Christianity is kind of just a melting pot of all of them. The next thing in my journal states that there was recently a cat mummy found, and the remains are very unique because it appears to be both a jungle cat and a house cat hybrid. So we've done this today with genetic engineering and stuff. It's called the Savannah breed, and it's a very large cat. It looks kind of like a leopard, but they didn't think it was possible for it to happen naturally. And the journal doesn't go into that much detail about it, but it doesn't say if any professionals were called in. But if this was me that found this thing, I'd be calling every single cat person from here to Egypt myself, trying to figure out if this thing was in fact either just a large cat or whether it was an actual hybrid. Because if it was an actual hybrid, the uses for that, if they were able to have multiple of them, would just be so many. Because Savannah cats that we have genetically engineered to make are very big. They are normally more like dogs than cats, and they're very loyal. But if the ancient Egyptians had them, they could use them in like fights. If they were fighting someone and they were losing, they could call on the Savannah cat, and then it'd be 2-on-1. Or, I mean, then it could also help with catching prey, like hunting dogs. It could be a hunting cat. But I mean, it just doesn't go into that much detail here, and I just don't really understand that too much. I personally would go into a great amount of detail, because personally I have a rather large amount of cats, and I am fairly well versed in how cats have come to be. But um, yeah, I mean, just doesn't say anything. They have no definite answer, and I would think that they would get on that because I think that's a major archaeological discovery.